In our American Literary Cultures class this semester, we learned about different virtues and how they are portrayed in literature throughout different time periods. The virtue that I will be focusing on today for my project is justice as a virtue. Plato and Aristotle defined justice as a virtue to be tied to the concept of fairness, people getting just what they deserve. The first piece of literature that I chose to look at for justice was A Model of Christian Charity by John Winthrop, written in 1630. John Winthrop was a Puritan preacher and also the governor of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. He preached his sermon to the Puritan colonists on the boat on the way to the New World. In A Model of Christian Charity, Winthrop largely emphasizes unity between the people and the importance of showing mercy to others by being generous and showing love to the poor. Justice that is defined in the sermon is simply dealing with fairly issues, enforcing laws in order to keep the unity and the structure of the community under control. The text says, "The same as before, but with more enlargement towards others and less respect toward ourselves and our own right. Hence it was that in the primitive church they sold all, had all things in common, neither did any man say that which he possessed was his own." This text shows that the justice that is defined in the sermon is once again enforcing laws to keep the unity and the structure of the community under control. Second literature was Justice in the Hands of an Angry God by Jonathan Edwards, written in 1741. Here Edwards uses the fear appeal to persuade his audience, and through the sermon, he defines justice as a punishment against evil, something we all deserve as sinners. He paints God's justice in the beginning with a lack of mercy. He says, "The bow of God's wrath is bent and the arrow made ready on the string, and justice bends the arrow at your heart and strains the bow, and it is nothing but the mere pleasure of God and that of an angry God without any promise or obligation at all, that keeps the arrow one moment from being made drunk with your blood." By saying justice bends the arrow at your heart, he means that we all, in terms of justice, are rightfully deserving of God's fury and wrath. Next, we're going to look at The Storm by Kate Chopin, which was written in 1898. And in the short story, Kate Chopin challenges the idea of justice, especially how many people believe that in order for justice to happen, especially in literature, when people do something that is considered morally wrong, they should be punished or that their actions should pay the price. But Kate Chopin says that just because people do something that is considered morally wrong does not mean they always have to or will face the consequences, or that the universe will punish them for their actions, such as karma. We can see that in the happy ending of this intermarital affair, as Calixa and Alcée suffer no consequences of their morally wrong actions. Instead, in the text, it says, "So the storm passed away and everyone was happy." And the story ends with a happy ending. Most people expect the act of infidelity to bring regret, pain, and suffering, but instead in this case, infidelity brings happiness to the adulterous pair, and ironically, they both are able to keep their spouses. In Trifles by Susan Glaspell, written in 1916, Glaspell argues that justice may not always mean that the person who committed the wrong legally is the only wrong party. Trifles is a story of an investigation of murder of John Wright, and people try to gather solid evidence that Mrs. Wright is the one who murdered him. Throughout the story, the women discover a dead bird in a cage and realize that Minnie Wright did murder her husband, but also it helps them draw to the conclusion that Mrs. Wright had been isolated like a bird locked up in a cage, trapped and robbed of her freedom by her husband and all alone. The text says, "She, come to think of it, she was kind of like a bird herself, real sweet and pretty and kind of timid and fluttery. How she did change. Somebody wrung its neck." This is talking about Mrs. Wright, and it hints that she was a victim of abuse. It also says, "But he was a hard man, Mrs. Peters, just to pass the time with him, like a raw wind that gets to the bone." This also shows that he was not the nicest man ever out in public. The woman understands that Minnie's murder of her husband was not just an act of murder, but also an important way of escape from abuse, isolation, oppression that took the life out of her. In this story, justice will not be done fairly with the legal system, because they will only recognize Minnie's murder. Therefore, through the story, Glaspell shows that justice may not always mean that the person who committed the wrong legally is the only wrong party. Lastly, The Raisin in the Sun is a play by Lorianne Hansberry written in 1957 that dives into a major form of social injustice, racism. When the Youngs, an African American family, try to move into Claiborne Park housing, the all-white neighborhood send Mr. Linder from the Housing Improvement Association to convince them to not come with a money offer. He tells the Youngs, and at the moment the overwhelming majority of our people out there feel that people get along better, take more of a common interest in the life of a community when they share a common background. Through this, the systematic racism is clearly seen, and the opposite of justice is explored in the text. Specifically, racism is defined as an unjust act of treating one group of people as seen as less and not equally, even though they are equals.